Hello, I'm Naill McLeod, the ROA's Racing Services Manager, and I'm going to talk about the changes to the racing rules of sailing that are coming in on the 1st of January 2021. We're going to go through what clubs might need to know. So we're going to start off with looking at some of the race signals that have changed. Now you may recognise the orange and the blue flags. These are signals that have been used for a number of years. But previously the orange flag wasn't actually in the rule book, so that is now in the rule book. You'll find it at the back of your copy of the RWA rule book if you have one, and that now says that the orange flag will be at one end of the starting line. Similarly, the blue flag, which was previously in the rule book, that has now changed to make it clear that the blue flag is at the end of the finishing line. Previously, it just meant the finishing vessel was on station, and now that blue flag is the one end of the finishing line. And an additional signal which has also been added is the victor flag. Those of you who've maybe been to some larger international events may have seen this written into some sailing instructions. What that says is that it requires any boats in the vicinity to monitor a communication channel for safety instructions. And that's tied into new Rule 37. Now, this rule could be useful for large dinghy open meetings where you might have a lot of coaches who are out on the water. They're not necessarily part of your organised safety fleet, but if something goes wrong, you want to have the ability to bring them into your safety fleet and make sure that they're listening to the instructions that you might give them. So this rule now makes it clear, everybody knows if you see flag victor, then all ribs and all boats in the water that have radios should be listening in to whichever VHF channel has been published in the sailing instructions. Now, one of perhaps the biggest change in terms of race management issues anyway, is the changes to the start and finish definition. So previously, both the start and the finish definition refer to any part of our hull, crew or equipment. Now, crew and equipment has been removed from the definition for 2021 to 2024. So it's now only the hull that defines whether a boat has crossed the start or the finish line. So race officers will now need to judge OCS and finish calls solely on the hull. Now, the reason for this is some challenges that a lot of race officers had found, particularly in starts with boats with large bowsprits such as these, perhaps also dinghies such as 49ers and lights. Previously, it was any part of the hull or equipment. So you may have seen, as a race officer, you may have seen this, the end of the bowsprit, but the rest of the boat might have been completely blanketed by other boats. So you had no idea which boat it was. It was actually OCS. Under the new rule, it is now the hull which defines it, and so hopefully that will make it much simpler for race officers to judge which boats are over the line. Now some changes in part 1, the fundamental rules. Rule 1 around safety, there's been a minor change there to now require support persons to give help to any person or vessel in danger. Hopefully that's something they would all have done anyway, but it's now clear that that is now in the rules. Rule 2, fair sailing, we've actually reverted back to what we had in the previous 2013 to 2016 rule book, where a breach for Rule 2 should now be scored as a disqualification, which is not excludable, so DNE. The reason for that is to try and ensure that there's consistency in application by protest committees for breaches of Rule 2. Rule 3 and Rule 4, essentially the same wording. The wording hasn't changed at all, but the rule numbers have switched. And throughout the book, you might see there's a number of rule numbers which have changed. So please, if you are using your old notice of race or sailing instructions as templates for next year, just make sure you cross-check that the numbers are still the same when referring to the RRS. Rule 5 now brings in what was Rule 84, covering rules governing organising authorities and officials, essentially saying that they shall be governed by the rules. And then Rule 6 brings together all the world sailing regulations that are racing rules, bringing them all together under one heading for clarity. Moving on to some other changes that might find in Part 2 around when boats meet that affect race management issues or notice of race or sailing instruction writing. This one is around room to tack at an obstruction. There was a problem which has been around for a number of years whereby particularly fast boats or in very windy and adverse conditions, hails for room to tack might not have been heard. There was no provision for that within the rules. Now, Rule 20 is a safety rule. It's to make sure that the boats aren't being forced to sail up the beach. So we want to make sure that everybody is aware that a hail has been made and a boat needs room to tack. So there's been an additional rule now added in the new rule book, and that says when conditions are such that a hail may not be heard, the boat shall also make a signal that clearly indicates her need for room to tack or response. And now that could be for a variety of methods. It could be from arm signals. For instance, in the team racing and match racing appendices, we already have definitions of how arm signals should be made. Or the notice race can actually specify the communication method that needs to be used, and that could be through a VHF channel if it's yachts, for instance, that are racing. And you can see there we've suggested some template wording which you may want to use in your notice race if you intend to invoke this rule. Now, when it comes to publishing notice race and sailing instructions, Rule 25 now makes it clear that the notice of race must be available to a boat before she enters. So before we open the entry for the event, we must have a published notice of race. And Appendix J now also makes it clear that a rule in a notice of race need not be repeated in the sailing instructions. So hopefully we can get these wordy documents shortened a little bit, because we don't need to be saying things twice in the sailing instructions if we've already said it in the notice of race. Personal flotation devices is another area where we might need to consider when we're writing notice of race and sailing instructions. These have now been the wording's been changed around and clarified, and hopefully made it much more simple to slot it into sailing instructions or notice of race. Before, we used to have quite a wordy statement, effectively changing Rule 40 if we wanted to ensure that people were wearing personal flotation devices all the time, as we might want to do in dinghy events or youth events, for instance. Now all we have to do is write a notice of race that says Rule 40.1 shall apply at all times whilst afloat. That's it. In scoring, there have been some significant changes around the scoring section. Rule 90.3. It's now been changed such that if it's so stated in a notice of race, the results will be final after 24 hours. The notice of race can also change this time limit. This should help avoid situations where a couple of weeks or days down the line, somebody suddenly questions a score. Well, that's not quite right. Well, actually now we can say 24 hours have passed, the time limit's done, the results are final. In exception, so these scores can be changed after the 24-hour time limit if it's down to an appeal decision, a Rule 69 decision, or under Rule 6, which is one of the world sailing regulations or codes. Sailing the course has now been written in as a definition. This takes out a lot of the wording that was in Rule 28 and creates a definition that a boat sails the course provided that a string representing her track from the time she begins to approach the starting line from its pre-start side to start until she finishes when drawn taut, passes each mark of the course for the race on the required side and in the correct order, touches each mark designated in the sailing instructions to be a rounding mark, and passes between the marks of a gate from the direction of the course from the previous mark. So that now makes it a definition of what it means to actually sail the course. And we also now have in Appendix A scoring, the race committee has the ability to score a boat that didn't sail the course accordingly. So previously, race committees would have had to protest a boat if they knew or believed she hadn't sailed the course correctly, because only the protest committee could take that action to make that boat score worse. Now race committees have that ability. But a word of warning, please, if you are the race committee, exercise a bit of caution when using this new power. Make sure it is something that you have clearly seen yourself as a race committee, or you have good evidence that a boat has not sailed the course correctly. Don't just rely on the story of somebody else who may have a conflict of interest. And of course, if the boat believes that they have been scored NSC incorrectly, then they can of course request redress from the protest committee, as it may be an improper action of the race committee. And so now we've got in Rule A10 as well, we've added to the abbreviations list NSC, which means did not sail the course. Appendix J, the Notice Race and Sailing Instructions. As I mentioned earlier, it now clearly says a rule in the Notice Race need not be repeated in the sailing instructions. There have been some extensive updates to Appendix J, so it's well worth having a good read through that. And Appendices K and L, which were the Notice of Race and Sailing Instruction guides, they have now been removed from the rule book, and they will be published separately as standalone documents on the World Sailing website. The reason for that is that, say, if it's in the rule book, it can only be changed once every 4 years, whereas now with it being published separately on the website, World Sailing can choose to update it as they please, which means we can take learnings from any new sailing instructions or notices of race that may be used at major events and might prove useful, and implement them as soon as possible in the guides without having to wait for the next quad. So that's just been a very quick run through of some of the key changes to the racing rules. Hopefully you've seen there's not that many changes to the rules this year, so shouldn't be too difficult for people to get their heads around, hopefully. If you do need any further information, then the RYA's Racing Rules Guidance Book is now published. That is available either through our website as a PDF or via the World Sailing Racing Rules app. You can find it in there under the countries and GBR code. That has a number of guidance notes on various aspects of the rules, including one on the changes to the rules, which includes a helpful summary table on the changes to the numbers and the titles, which may be useful for cross-checking your notices, race and sailing instructions. Additionally, we also have our advisory services. If you have any questions related to either race management matters or racing rules matters, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with us in the office, and we will put you in touch with the relevant team. I hope you find that useful, and as I say, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thanks. Goodbye.